It looks like dieter, but he was called Dieter Spikereit. He's 6'4", tall, lanky, skinny guy. All of his friends in the Air Force Base called him Spike. That was his nickname. First 5 letters of our last name, Spike, which I find funny now because Woody, you know how Woody likes to give people nicknames? That's what he calls me now, Spike. And I've never told him this, but that's my dad's nickname. And every time he calls me Spike, he walks down the hallway of my office. He'll pop his head down to my office and say, "What's up, Spike?" And he'll keep on walking. And I think about my dad every time he does that. That was his nickname. He's an interesting guy. He was born in Hamburg, Germany. Immigrated to the United States of America when he was a boy, settled in Queens, New York, where he and his family, where he was born and where he was raised there in the city, and didn't know a word of English, had to learn English all by himself, took a German class in high school. Of course, he's fluent in German, but he flunked the class because he kept correcting the teacher. The teacher didn't like that, kicked him out of class. Eventually graduated from high school, met and married my mother, who also was born and raised in New York City, enlisted in the United States Air Force, and the rest is history. He's an interesting man, my dad. We didn't have a lot in common, my dad and I. He was very mechanical, could fix anything, could build anything, and my wife is here, she'll tell you that that is definitely not me. I'm that guy who looks at the HGTV, do you know that channel, Home Garden Television? And I just loathe those people who can fix and do anything. And my wife sits by me on the couch and she sees them building a back deck in a half an hour, and she looks over at me as if to say, "What's the matter with you? Why can't you do that?" Because I'm not mechanical at all, but my dad, he was. We didn't have that in common. He loved to fish. He was a big-time fisherman. He would go to the pier. We lived in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. He would go to the pier and would just fish for hours and hours, and he would invite me to come with him, but just wasn't interested in doing that. It just wasn't my thing. And I love sports. I've always loved sports. He really wanted nothing to do with sports. Didn't like it at all. Didn't have a lot in common. But the one thing we did have in common was we both loved to play chess. We loved to play chess. When I was 8 years old, my dad pulled out a chessboard and he showed me all the pieces on the board and taught me the basic strategy, and we started to play chess together. 8 years old, and he would whoop me. He was ruthless, no mercy at all. 8 moves, checkmate. 15 moves, checkmate. 20 moves, checkmate. And I would get so frustrated and so angry with him. I'd say, "Dad, you gotta help me out here. You're killing me. This is no good. I'm not learning anything." And he would say, "Son, the only way you can learn is by doing." And he set the board back up, and we'd continue to play, and I'd get more and more frustrated until I finally reached the point of frustration. I'd say, "Dad, I'm not playing anymore. You've got to teach me something. You got to tell me something. You got to help me out here." And this is what my dad would say. He used to say this to me all the time. He would say, "Son, you can't only anticipate what your next move is going to be. You've also got to anticipate what your opponent's next move is going to be." I think that's a pretty good word of advice, especially when we look at the book of Nehemiah. I think Nehemiah and the builders of Jerusalem would have to follow that same advice. They could no longer only be concerned with what their next move was going to be. That's chapter 3 of Nehemiah. We looked at that last week. But now they would also have to concern themselves with what their opponent's next move was going to be. And we can read what the next moves of the opponents, these individuals who were governing the land of Jerusalem and the surrounding vicinity, who had a deep stranglehold on that region politically and financially. And these opponents of Nehemiah and the builders of Jerusalem would do anything within their power to stop the progress from happening, to oppose Nehemiah, to thwart the effort that was underway, to discontinue the plans that had been made. They would do anything in their power to stop their work. Nehemiah would have to concern himself not only with what his next move was going to be, but also with what his opponent's next move. And we can see what their moves were. We can see that, first of all, they were going to start with a verbal assault, a verbal onslaught to try to discourage and ridicule Nehemiah and the builders of Jerusalem. Chapter 4, verse 1, when Sanballat heard that we were rebuilding the wall, he became angry and was greatly incensed. He ridiculed the Jews, and in the presence of his associates and the army of Samaria, he said, "What are these feeble Jews doing? Do they really think that they can restore the wall? Do they think that they're going to be able to offer sacrifices again here in Jerusalem? Will they finish it in a day? Do they really think that they can bring these stones back to life from the heaps of rubble that they were, burned as they are. And then Tobiah the Ammonite, in verse 3, he joins in with Sanballat, who was at his side. He said, what are they building? I mean, if even a fox climbed up on it, he would break it down, these wall of stones. They came at them with verbal onslaughts, trying to discourage them, trying to frustrate them, trying to stop the progress. And when their verbal onslaughts appear to be futile in their efforts, they progress from verbal onslaughts to physical threats. You can see in verse 8, they all plotted together to come and fight against Jerusalem and stir up trouble against it. Verse 11, also our enemies said, before they know it or see us, we will be right there among them and will kill them and put an end to the work. They were bullies. Did you have a bully when you were a kid? Maybe you were the bully, I don't know. 5th grade was my bully. His name was Brett, which I find kind of humorous. No offense to the Bretts in the room. It's not the toughest name in the world. And yet, he was my bully, and he would pick on me all the time, and he would make fun of me and would kind of follow me around and push me around. And I just took it because that's just the kind of kid I was. I wasn't interested in fighting him. I don't know why he chose me to pick on me. He was a son of a colonel. I was on an Air Force base, and colonels on that Air Force base were the highest position that lived there on the base. And so he and all of his other colonel friends lived on a circle. We called it the Colonel's Circle. The grass was greener, and the trees grew taller, and the houses were bigger on Colonel's Circle. And he knew it. He knew that he was son of a colonel, and that my dad was just an NCO, just a non-commissioned officer, everyday man. And so for whatever reason, I don't know if that's what it was, but he used to pick on me all the time. And I just took it. And one day, reached the point of frustration. I went home, and I was frustrated over this, and my dad could see this, and he sat me down, and I told him what was going on, and my dad listened very patiently, and he said to me, he said, son, a bully is going to keep being a bully until you give him a reason not to be a bully anymore. He said, son, do you understand what I'm telling you? And I said, no, Dad, I don't know what you're talking about. And he said, all right, son, let me put it this way. He said, son, there just comes a time in a man's life when you got to take matters into your own hands. Now that I understood, that I got. I'm like, okay, tomorrow I am taking matters into my own. I'm not condoning my actions here. I'm just describing, not prescribing what happened. I went to school, and I was going to take matters in my own hands, and the moment came. I'm on the playground, and I could see my peripheral vision. I could see Brett slyly, like a fox, sneaking up behind me, ready to do whatever he was going to do to me. And just in that moment of inspiration, I turned around, and I grabbed him by both shoulders, and I spun him around 360 degrees, and I threw him on the ground, and I took matters into my own hands in that moment, yeah. And I tell you, Brett, again, not condoning, just describing here, but Brett never picked on me again from that day forward. And in fact, we actually became pretty good friends and teammates on a soccer team together for the next 4 years of my life. But all that aside, that situation was handled pretty easily. But the situation that Nehemiah and the builders of Jerusalem find themselves in, their bullies, we're not going to back down so easy. And the opposition that we face, the very real opposition that we face, he's not going to back down so easy. And you understand, just like Nehemiah, just like that was a very real threat, real opposition that Nehemiah and the builders were faced with, likewise, we are faced with that same threat in our life. If it's true, and I do believe it's true, what President Proctor said last week, that everything rises and falls on leadership, then you understand, because of who you are and because of where you are here at Ozark Christian College, you are public enemy number one to the great opposer. He will do anything within his power and within his ability to discourage you, to frustrate you, to cause you to compromise, to cause you to put down the hammer and trowel and say, it's not worth it. I don't know what that opposition looks like for you right now in your life. Maybe you're experiencing it. Maybe it's very real, very clear in your life. Or maybe it's an opposition that you anticipate to come down the road someday, but it's real. It's there. And like my father used to say to me, you can't just anticipate what your next move is going to be. You're going to have to also, at times, anticipate what your opponent's next move is going to be. But now here's the question. The real question that's before us is how do we respond? How do we endure the opposition when it comes? How do we gain victory over the enemy who seeks to stop us, thwart us, oppose us, discourage us, frustrate us? Whenever I was playing my dad chess and I would get frustrated because, he would just come at me time after time, game after game, and I would never be able to do anything in response to it. At times, he would also say this to me. He would say, son, your best defense is your best offense. Now, that didn't make sense to me when I was a kid. I didn't quite get that. But now looking back, it kind of makes sense. The best way to defend yourself is not to sit back in a corner, cowering in fear. The best way to be defensive is to go on the offensive, is to do something about it, is to respond to the opposition when we face it in our lives. And that's exactly what we see Nehemiah doing here in Nehemiah chapter 4. He goes on the offensive, he responds. And from him, we can learn how we should respond whenever we face opposition in our life. First of all, his first response is to pray. That shouldn't come as a surprise, should it? That our first response whenever we face opposition is that we pray. And that's exactly what we see Nehemiah doing all through this book. You can go back into chapter 1. You could see, in fact, the book of Nehemiah is in a sort of prayer. The way it ends, the last chapter of Nehemiah, if you look it up, you'll see all through that chapter, Nehemiah is praying through it all. And we see that right here in chapter 4. When the verbal assault comes, verse 4 of chapter 4, hear us, O our God, for we are despised. Turn their insults back on their heads. Give them over in the plunder in the land of captivity. Do not cover up their guilt or blot out their sins from your sight, for they have thrown insults in the face of the builders. When the verbal assault comes, the first response that Nehemiah has is to pray. And not just when the verbal assaults come, but also the physical threats we can see in verse 9. His first response, verse 9, but we prayed to our God, and we posted a guard day and night to meet this threat. I know that it goes without saying, but it still needs to be said. Whenever you find yourself faced with opposition, whether it's your time here at Ozark or future ministry, it's easy to have a determined spirit and to go into that head first, but we need to stop and go on our knees and pray that God will strengthen us and give us the courage to meet whatever opposition we face. Can I just, for practical purposes, kind of crack open my own prayer closet? Almost every day, every morning, whenever I wake up and I have my time of prayer, and especially during times of opposition, I serve as an elder at Carterville Christian Church, and grateful to have many of the staff members here, and Robin Seigers, my preacher, is here, and they know that over the last number of years, we've faced some very real opposition that we've had to deal with as a church family. And whenever we face that opposition, one of the two things that I always pray in the morning and in the midst of the opposition are these two prayers, and I'd like to, offer them to you. First prayer that I always offer is this: Lord, fill me with your Spirit. Lord, may I today and in the midst of this turmoil, may I walk in step with the Spirit. No matter what comes against us, what comes against me, Lord, help me to demonstrate the fruit of the Spirit in my life. Help me to walk with love and joy and patience, peace and kindness, gentleness, and especially self-control. So Lord, fill me with your Spirit. I offer that prayer to you. And here's the second prayer that I almost always, every morning, especially in the midst of opposition: Lord, grant me your wisdom today. It's a James 1 prayer. If anyone lacks wisdom, what should he do? Just ask God. And God, who is rich in mercy, he will give it freely to anyone who asks of him. And when you receive that wisdom, James says, don't doubt it. If you doubt it, you'll be like a wave of the sea being tossed to and fro. In fact, James goes on to say that a person who asks for the wisdom of God, receives the wisdom of God, but then doesn't follow it, doubts it, that person is a two-souled man, James says. Lord, grant me your wisdom in the midst of the opposition. Our first response, whenever we face opposition, is to pray, pray for the wisdom of God in our life. And that's what we see Nehemiah doing. And not only does he pray in response to the opposition, but he also responds by continuing the work. He doesn't stop the work. He continues the progress. And I love that refrain. It's found all through chapter 4. If you're following along, you'll see it in verse 6. So we rebuilt the wall till all of it reached half its height, for the people worked. They worked and they continued to work with all of their heart. Verse 15, when our enemies heard that we were aware of their plot and that God had frustrated it, we all returned to the wall, each to his own work. We didn't stop the work. From verse 16, from that day on, half of my men did the work, while the other half were equipped with spears and shields and bows and armor. Verse 17, those who carried materials did their work with one hand, and they held a weapon in the other. And I love verse 19. Then I said to the nobles and the officials and the rest of the people, the work is extensive, so spread out, for we are widely separated from each other along the walls. And here it is, verse 21. Here's the key phrase. So we continued the work with half the men holding spears from the first light of dawn till the stars came out. Whenever you face opposition, whenever you face intimidation, and whenever you feel discouraged and frustrated, whether it's a student at Ozark or in your future ministry, it's easy sometimes to give in to the temptation, to shrink back, to quit. But the encouragement that I want to give you this morning is continue the work. Don't stop in the midst of the opposition. Continue to do the work that God has laid out for you, has planned before you. As many of you know, my primary role here is to teach preaching classes, which means every semester I get 3 preaching classes. Usually they're made up of about 20 students or so. So you can imagine that's a lot of sermons that I get to listen to in the course of a semester. Now, we have math here at Ozark Christian College. Now, I just want to point out, we're 3 for 3 in chapel services mentioning math at Ozark Christian College. So Lyle Welch, there it is. I've given it to you. So you can do the math. You can try to figure out how many sermons I get to listen to in a semester. 20 students per class. They each preach twice in the course of a semester. Plus, I get to watch those sermons outside of class on video in a sermon review time, not to mention chapels and not to mention Sunday mornings. You know how many sermons that is? A lot. That's what that is. It's a whole lot. And it's great. It's a great blessing to my soul. And you can imagine teaching, this is my 8th year here at Ozark and a couple years at Lincoln. Over these last 10 years or so, a lot of interesting things have happened in the course of those sermons. I mean, I've had drill sergeants in the room. I've had a guy who had his head shaved while he was preaching. I've had 5-minute sermons. That guy was ready to cry after he was done. And I've had 55-minute sermons. I was ready to cry after that sermon was over. I've had quiet sermons and loud sermons and everything in between, and just lots of great experiences. One of the most memorable experiences of preaching that I've had in class was when a guy named Charlie Landis preached. You guys, some of you older students maybe, Charlie, great guy. Yeah, just a great guy. And in my expository preaching class during that semester, the second sermon in class was to be preached without notes. He was very nervous about this, extremely nervous. He's a great student, worked hard on the sermon, but preaching without notes, he was afraid of it. But he was committed to do it, and the moment came, the day came, he stood up there in front of the class, and he was as white as a ghost, had his Bible in his hand, no notes before him, and he started preaching his sermon, and he was hyperventilating. Between every word, he would take these deep breaths. And between each word, he would do this, and he got whiter and whiter, and he started laughing at himself, and he was forgetting his words, and it was just going downhill real fast. And I was getting nervous. I'm in the back. I'm like, he's going to pass out. I know it. He's going to pass out, and his parents are going to sue me because I made him do this assignment. This is going to be bad. And he's breathing heavily, and he just can't compose himself until finally about a minute, 2 minutes into the sermon, he grabs, it was a big wooden podium at the time. He stops in the middle of the sermon, grabs the side of the podium, and drops his head on the podium. Thud. And you hear the knocking sound. The class is just silent. We're looking at each other, they're looking at me. What do we do? Until finally, he raises his head back up, and he looks right at me, and he says, Damien, can I start over? And I say, sure, Charlie, you can start over. And then he did. He went right back to the beginning, and it was like all the nerves were gone. He was breathing normal. There was color in his face. And he preached a 16, 17-minute sermon, and it was great. I mean, it was really, really good. And I don't know that I have ever been more proud of a student than I was that day, because he continued. He didn't stop. He continued the work. And I say that to you, students of Ozark Christian College. Continue the work until your dying breath. Even when you fail, that's not a reason to quit. That's a reason to repent. That's a reason to confess. But continue the work that God has for you. That's how we respond to opposition whenever we face it. When we face that opposition, we pray that God will fill us with his wisdom, and we continue the work that God has placed before us. But ultimately, we trust. We trust that our God will give us the victory. I mean, that is the heartbeat of Nehemiah chapter 4. The heartbeat of Nehemiah chapter 4 is found in verses 14 and 20. After I looked things over, I stood up, Nehemiah says, and I said to the nobles and to the officials and to the rest of the people, don't be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, who is great and awesome. Man, I wish I could follow you around in ministry. I wish I could follow you over the next 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years of your life. And every time you face opposition, every time you face hardship, every time you come out of that elders meeting beat up and bruised, and every time you struggle financially, and every time you mess up, I wish I could be there. I wish I could look at you and say, remember the Lord, who is great and awesome. Don't be afraid. Don't be discouraged. Continue the work. I love it. Verse 20, wherever you are, wherever you hear the sound of the trumpet, you join us there. And I love this phrase, for our God will fight for us. At the end of the story, when the last page is read out loud, do not miss the fact that this story is not about Nehemiah, and it's not about the builders of Jerusalem. This is a story about God. God who will fight for us, God who will give us victory. And when we face opposition in life, we pray that he will fill us with his wisdom. We continue the work with all of our heart and with excellence and diligence. But at the end of it all, we trust that our God will prevail. He will fight for us. Let me put it this way. I coach boys soccer. I'm not talking about the Ozark boys. Under 12 boys. My son's team, and it's fun. They work hard, they want to do well, they try their best, and but they're still young enough that they get a little tear in their eye when they get knocked down. So just imagine that I'm coaching my son's soccer team, and one of my boys gets knocked to the ground, and I rush out onto the field, and he's scraped up a little bit, and pick him up, I brush the dust off of him, and I can see that tear forming in his eye, but he's covering it up because he doesn't want anybody to see it. And I look him in the eyes, and I say, all right, son, got to keep going. Brush off the dirt, pick him up. And I say to him, son, when the going gets tough, the tough get going. Get out there and score a goal. And we like that expression, don't we? When the tough get going, the going get tough. And generally speaking, it's a good truth, I suppose. I suppose there's some general truth to it. But the problem is, it's human-based. It assumes that we can overcome our opposition by our own strength, by our own might, by our own ability. But you understand, our battle, our fight in this world is not against flesh and blood. By your own strength, by your own power, by your own ability, you will lose. You won't be able to overcome the one who is deceiving this world by your own strength, but we put our trust in the God who has already overcome the enemy, who has already defeated him by his death, burial, and resurrection. That's who we serve. That's who we trust, the one who has gained victory already. And so you've heard it said, when the tough get going, the going get tough. But I tell you, when the faithful are opposed, then the opposed must remain faithful. That's our call. You got that, homiletic students? That's the dominant thought right there. When the faithful are opposed, then the opposed must remain faithful. We must remain faithful to the one who has already gained victory over the enemy, because our God, he will fight for us. So I tried. I tried my hardest. Sometimes the games would last hours when I became a teenager. Sometimes they would last days, like we would have to stop and come back to it the next day and the next day, and I tried my best to beat him. And there were times that I thought I had him. Dad, I got you this time. And I had to move and play, and I was gonna get him, but then blindsided, and there's something I didn't see, and checkmate, game over. I get so frustrated, but we continue to play. And I was certain that someday, I'm gonna beat my dad in chess. And then on May 31st, I got a phone call from the hospital. They called my school. I was in class. They told me to come to the guidance counselor's office. And they said, your dad's in the hospital. You need to go right away. So I went to the hospital. And for the next 3 days, I lived in that hospital. And I said my goodbyes. And on June 2nd, 1992, my dad passed away. And it was tragic and difficult. And I was a brand new Christian at the time, trying to make sense of it all. And you may even think this is strange, I don't know. But at the funeral and in the days that followed the funeral, lots of grief and sadness, lots of thoughts and words expressed. But I'm telling you, over and over in my head, this is the thought that I had. Doggone it. I'm never going to beat my dad in chess now. Is that weird? I remember thinking that over and over. Man, I'm never going to beat him in chess now. But one day, those of us who have remained faithful to the one who has overcome, those of us who prayed for the wisdom of God to fill us and consume us, those of us who have continued the work faithfully throughout our life, those of us who have trusted in the one who has overcome the enemy by his death and resurrection, those of us who will enter our reward, and we will, as we heard last week, hear our Heavenly Father say, well done, faithful servant. Those of us who have remained faithful to the end will enter our heavenly reward, and on that day, we will be able to look down upon the enemy, and we will be able to say to him, checkmate. You're dismissed.